I worked nights at a distribution warehouse for just under a year. It sat on the outskirts of town, far enough out that you wouldn't pass it by accident. There was a single access road off the main highway that led straight to the gate, and nothing else down there except for scrubland and a few overgrown trees that acted like a natural sound barrier. During the day, it probably looked ordinary, trucks in and out, workers coming and going. At night, it felt like the building was on an island. Once you turned off the highway, everything went quiet. No streetlights, no houses, just the glow from the warehouse lights reflecting off of a fence in the empty lot. The night shift ran from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. The job itself wasn't difficult. I handled inventory control, which meant I spent most of my time walking the building alone with a scanner, logging incoming pallets, double checking shipments, and occasionally doing spot checks in the trailer yard before it got too late. There were usually a dozen people on shift, a handful of forklift drivers, a couple of loaders per bay, one supervisor and security. Security coverage was supposed to be 2 guards, but in practice it was almost always 1. Management framed it as quiet hours, like the night somehow made the place safer. Security guards for most of the time I worked there was a guy named Frank. He was older, quiet, didn't really seem interested in making friends either. He did his job thoroughly and without any complaints. He walked the fence line on a schedule, checked the gates and logged everything, even when management told him not to bother. Nothing happened for the first few months. The nights blurred together, scanned pallets, logged numbers and drank a bad coffee, then watched the clock crawl forward. The worst part was the silence, when the forklift stops and the trucks were gone. The building made noises of its own. Pipes ticking, metal contracting, and the low hum of an electrical system running lights that didn't really need to be on. The first thing that stood out happened Tuesday early in November. It was cold, damp, and windy enough that you could hear the fence rattling now and then. We had 2 late inbound trucks scheduled, which meant the bays were active past midnight. I was working one of the central aisles when my scanner lost connection for a few seconds. That wasn't unusual, but the error referenced gate access instead of inventory. It resolved on its own, and I didn't think about it again until Frank came over the radio saying that front gate was open. The gate was never open. It was chained and padlocked, and the key stayed on Frank's ring. When we went to look, the chain was still looped through, and the lock was still attached, but it wasn't locked. The gate had been pulled open just far enough for someone to pass through. There were footprints in the gravel leading up the road, regular shoes, not work boots. The print stopped at the gate, turned around and went back towards the road. They didn't continue into the lot. Nothing else was disturbed, no damage and no missing equipment. The gate was closed and locked again, and the shift continued. At the time it felt strange but manageable. People were defaulting to the simplest explanations. Someone was messing around or bored. Frank didn't buy that explanation though, but he didn't really push it. He just logged the incident and moved on. Over the next several nights, small things started to happen. Not every night and not consistent, just enough to notice. The gate sensor would trip briefly with no visible cause. The lights near the fence would flicker, even though maintenance said there were no issues. Frank mentioned seeing movement near the trailers during his rounds, shapes that didn't stay long enough to make much sense of. Nothing ever showed up clearly on the cameras either. The motion happened just outside the field of view, or it was too dark to resolve into anything useful. Management wasn't interested as normal. They told Frank to stop filing reports unless something concrete happened. Without footage or damage, they considered it a non-issue. People on the shift adjusted to it without talking about it. Breaks stopped being taken alone and smoke bricks moved closer into the building. No one lingered in the yard once it got past certain hours. A couple of weeks after the gate incident, someone showed up at the front entrance in the middle of the night. The front doors were glass, facing the lot. The person just stood outside the light, hood up, head down. They didn't knock or try the handle, they just kind of stood there. When they left, they didn't hurry. They walked away towards the edge of the property where the lights thinned out. After that, the warehouse felt different. Not louder or quieter, just occupied in a way it hadn't been before. Frank quit shortly after, no notice and without any explanation. Management said he'd just found another job. They replaced him with a younger guard who clearly hadn't been trained beyond the basic procedures. He treated the job like a formality and didn't take any concerns seriously. He lasted less than a week. One night he went out to check the gate despite being told not to, and came back inside shaken, saying someone had been standing behind one of the trailers and moved sideways when he tried to get a clearer look. It looked like they were intentionally staying outside of the flashlight beam. Police were called, searched the lot, the road and the surrounding area. They didn't find anyone. They didn't dismiss it completely, but without the evidence there wasn't much they could do. After that night, the night shift closed itself in. Doors locked earlier, lights shut off in unused sections, and people clustered in groups. The buildings felt like a bunker. I stayed longer than I should have, mostly because nothing actually happened. As long as everything stayed in the realm of maybe, it was easy enough to rationalise. The night I finally decided to leave was normal, right up until it wasn't. It was around about 4 in the morning, a stretch of time where everyone is exhausted and waiting for that shift to end. I was near the front, putting inventory sheets in, when the lobby phone rang. That phone almost never rang at night. Vendors and drivers had other numbers. Hearing it in the quiet space felt so wrong. When I answered, there was silence at first, just breathing, and then a voice said they could see me. I didn't respond. I turned towards the window and saw a phone lit up in the lot, pointing at the building. By the time anyone else got there, that light was gone. Minutes later, the gate sensor triggered again. This time, the cameras caught it. Someone walked through the open gate calmly, crossed the lot, stopped near the side of the building where the cameras didn't fully cover the wall. They stood there briefly and walked back out the same way they came. It didn't feel like an attempt to break in, it felt more like a test. Police responded quickly. They reviewed the footage and said it looked like someone was familiar with the property. Someone was watching the routines. Nothing more happened that night. I quit 2 days later. A few weeks after I left, I heard they caught someone trying to break into the office area during the night shift. The alarm triggered and the police found him nearby. He used to work there apparently. They found keys, notes, schedules, observations about staff and timing. After that, the incident stopped. Looking back, what unsettles me isn't any single moment. It's how so much time passed where we knew something was wrong, but couldn't point to one clear reason to stop everything. Someone had been watching long before we even noticed, learning our patterns and standing just far enough away that we doubted ourselves. And if they hadn't decided to act the way they did, we might have just kept working there, telling ourselves it was nothing, until it wasn't. I worked the night shift at a gas station just off of a 2-lane highway for a little over a year. It wasn't in the middle of nowhere, but it wasn't close to anything either. A few miles outside of town, surrounded by trees and fields, with the highway being the only reason anyone ever stopped there. During the day it was a normal place, families stopping for fuel, contractors grabbing a coffee or two, locals coming in for cigarettes. At night it turned into something else. Between midnight and 5, traffic dropped off sharply. You could go an hour without seeing another car, and when headlights did appear you noticed them immediately. I worked alone, that was standard. One clerk, a counter, and a row of cameras, and a silent expectation that nothing serious would happen. Management framed it as a low-risk shift. If anything went wrong, you were supposed to call the police and wait. The store itself was small, easy to keep an eye on. 2 short aisles, coolers along the back wall, and bathrooms down a narrow hallway. The counters faced the front windows, which looked out into the pumps and the lot. From where I stood most of the night, I could see everything that mattered. Most of the nights followed the same rhythm. A few customers around midnight, usually people passing through, long stretches of quiet, occasionally cars pulling in just to use the pumps and leave. I cleaned, restocked, checked dates on shelves, and watched the cameras mostly out of habit. The first thing that stood out happened about a month in. Even then it didn't feel important. A man came in one morning. He was alone, maybe in his mid-30s and dressed plainly. Hoodie, jeans, and nothing else that really stood out. He bought a little bottle of water, paid in cash, and left, and that should really have been the end of it. The next night he came in again. Same time, same water, same quiet, efficient movement. He didn't browse and didn't look around much, he just came in, paid, and left. By the 3rd night I started noticing a pattern. It was the same man, during the same time frame, the same purchase, always in cash, always unusually calm, and always alone. It still didn't feel threatening though. Plenty of regulars have routines and night shift attracts repetition. Over the next couple of weeks he kept coming back. Not every night, but often enough that I started to expect him. Sometimes he'd fuel up first, and sometimes he'd come straight inside. Sometimes he'd linger for a few seconds near the counter before paying, like he was about to say something, and then thought better of it. He never caused problems, never raised his voice, never asked for anything unusual. He just existed in the store in a way that stuck with me. I started noticing the smaller details. He always parked at the same pump, the one furthest from the door. He always stood in roughly the same spot at the counter. Never used the bathroom and never bought anything other than water. He also started asking small questions. Nothing alarming, just like what time the morning shift showed up or whether the bathrooms were cleaned overnight or in the morning. Once he asked how often the cash drawer was empty during the night. I answered without thinking much of it. None of the questions were invasive on their own. They just sounded like idle curiosity. Over time though, they added up. I mentioned him to my manager once, casually, like you'd mention a regular customer. She didn't think much of it. As far as she was concerned, regulars were a good thing. A few weeks later I started noticing that he didn't always come inside. Some nights he'd pull into the lot, park at his usual pump and just sit in the car. Engine off, lights off, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes even longer. I could see him on the camera, sitting there facing the building. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't leaning back, just sat upright, hands low, staring ahead. Eventually he'd leave without coming in. I told myself he was resting, or waiting for someone, or thinking. There were plenty of reasonable explanations, and I used just about every one of them. Around that same time, I started noticing changes in my own behaviour. I checked the cameras more often, started locking the back hallway door at night, even though it wasn't required. I stopped stepping outside to take any trash out until the morning shift had already arrived. Nothing had actually happened, I just felt better staying inside. One night the man came in later than usual, closer to 4 in the morning I think. The store was quiet and the sky had that faint early morning grey to it. He brought his water, stood at the counter a moment longer than normal. He asked if I ever worked alone during the day. I said no, night shift only. He nodded and asked how long until the morning cashier arrived. I told him. He didn't respond right away, just stood there, looking at the counter like he was committing something to memory, then paid and left. After that night he stopped coming inside altogether. Still showed up though, the same car at the same pump, the same habit of sitting in the dark for a while before leaving. Once, when I checked the camera, I realised that he was sitting in the car with the engine off and the door slightly open. Not enough to get out, just enough that I could see the interior light briefly. That was the first time I felt genuinely uncomfortable. A few nights later, I found a small piece of paper on the counter when I came back from the bathroom. It was blank, no writing, no markings, just folded once and placed neatly near the register. I checked the cameras. He had been inside while I was in the back. I watched the footage back. He walked in, stood at the counter, placed the paper down and left. Never touched anything else. I threw the paper away and didn't tell anyone. The night I quit was quiet right up until the end of the shift. The man's car pulled into the lot around about 4:30 and parked at his usual pump. He didn't have the engine off this time though. The headlights stayed on, aimed directly at the windows. I watched him on the camera. He didn't move. After several minutes, he stepped out of the car and walked a few steps towards the building. He stopped just short of the lights from the store, standing where the reflection in the glass made it hard to see his face. He stayed there for a long time, long enough that I started to think about what I'd say if he came inside, long enough that I realised my hands were shaking. Eventually he turned around, got back in his car and left. Nothing else happened. I finished my shift, clocked out and went home. When I woke up later that day I called my manager and told her I wasn't coming back. I didn't have a dramatic reason, I didn't tell her I was scared, just said the hours weren't working for me anymore. She didn't really argue. I still pass that gas station sometimes when I'm driving late. It looks the same pumps, same lights, and same quiet lot. I don't know what that man wanted. Maybe nothing. Maybe something that never quite formed. What unsettles me isn't the idea that he would have done something. It's how easily he blended into the routine. How long it took before I noticed that my job had quietly changed from working alone to being observed. And how close I came to treating that feeling as normal.